Hey everybody, and welcome to Chapter 7. We are in our second chapter of memory, our 7th overall chapter. And so, normally I recommend that you tackle these videos in order, but especially for this chapter because we're going to be talking a lot about the concepts of Chapter 6. We're going to be talking a lot about long-term memory and working memory and things like that. And so it's a good idea to go through all that first before you jump into this one. Depending on which version of the textbook you have, some of the older versions of the textbook, this chapter is a little bit different. So if you see me talking about things that aren't in this chapter or aren't in last chapter, just hang tight because it might be just, the differences in the additions to the textbook. But anyways, that's all boring stuff. Let's get into the exciting stuff, which is memory. I have a few videos for you to check out here. This one right here, the remembering the first 100 digits of pi, we're going to be checking back in on that one. So I don't recommend that you watch it just yet. But it is, if you watch any of these, that is the one that I want you to check out. The others are really interesting, but not necessarily something that you would have to have for your education in cognitive psychology. The first is a very interesting case study of a border collie dog whose name was Chaser. She and her owner have passed away. I just wanted to say that off the top because every time I show this in class or show anything related to Chaser, people want to ask about her. But this was like in 2008 or something like that, and that was a long time ago. So that is a video about a dog with a remarkable memory, very interesting. We also have a video for the Kuleshov effect. If you have taken Intro to Film, you may remember the Kuleshov effect. I will talk about that when we get to that point in the chapter. So if you are confused or have no idea what I'm talking about, this video will light your way. And then finally we have a video on Stephen Wiltshire. There are a bunch of videos on YouTube about Stephen Wiltshire. Stephen Wiltshire is an individual who is on the autism spectrum and was nonverbal for the first several years of his life, and perhaps as a result of being nonverbal for a good portion of his development, learned other ways to encode memories. Most of us use language to encode memories. Stephen Wiltshire, on the other hand, seems to encode things using just pure raw visuals. So you can see he has a remarkable memory and an ability to kind of translate that memory into drawings. Just from looking at things for a couple of minutes, he can draw them from memory. It's amazing. So check out those videos. Let's get into it. The outline for what we're talking about today, I think you can kind of neatly divide this up into two sections, where the first piece we're going to be having is the context or memory tricks, basically, is like how can we improve memory, and then the second half is going to be about the failure of memory, about where memory fails us and why we can't remember certain things. Okay, so this chapter is titled The Many Types of Memory. And I talked about this a good bit in chapter 6 about how there are lots of different forms of memory, and you can kind of get here's a nice roadmap. So where have we been so far? So far in chapter 6, we have mostly kind of stuck over to this, and that's mostly been it. Maybe that we did some of this episodic memory stuff, but we didn't call it episodic memory. So most of what we've been talking about is explicit memory. In other words, memory for elements that we are conscious for. So if I were to ask you, who was the very first president of the United States? Your ability to answer that, you consciously being able to say George Washington, that means that your memory for who was the first president is an explicit memory. That is different from other forms of memory, which we call implicit memories. Implicit memories are memories that we are not directly conscious of. And no, I don't mean like repressed memories or things like that. I mean something a little bit more open, something that you deal with all the time. So my favorite example of this, actually, because I love to give you examples before I tell you the definition. My favorite example of an implicit memory is tying your shoes. If I asked you to tie your shoes right now, could you do it? Yes, you can do it. But if I asked you which string goes over top first whenever you're looping? Is it the left string or the right string? If I asked you that, you have to really seriously consider that, right? You have to pause, you have to think, and a lot of you might even have to like hold up your hands to try to imagine doing it, right? So that is an example of an implicit memory. It is a memory that you have. It is something that you can do. It is a memory, but it is not one you can easily consciously recall. It is not one you can easily verbalize. And implicit memories fall into 4 different kind of categories, and we'll kind of check in on a lot of these as we go on today. But I do want to highlight classical conditioning because as much as I like to kind of tease behaviorism and stuff like that, I think that cognitive psychology and behaviorism are very compatible in a lot of ways. And one of them is like here, where we talk about classical conditioning as a form of memory. Classical conditioning, drawing associations from our environment, or even taste aversions. You eat something, you get sick, and then you want to avoid it because every time you smell it, it makes you feel sick. That is a form of memory, right? Because if we talked about what memory is your ability to respond to something that is not currently present. That is absolutely something that happens in classical conditioning. All right, so let's get into it. First, we're going to be talking mostly about this section over here, explicit memory. In the second half of what we're doing today, we'll talk more about implicit memories. So let's get into the explicit side of things. So we talked about we talked a little bit about retrieval cues, and I talked about how like when you forget something, that part of what that is you lost the ability to retrieve that memory. So it's not that you forgot that information, it's that you couldn't access it, right? So the first half of this video, I guess, is going to be about how can we strengthen those retrieval cues? How can we come up with good tips or strategies to retrieve information that can otherwise be hard to retrieve? That's what we're looking at. So your ability to retrieve memories is both helped and hurt by the context in which you learn that stuff. Because, and this is a general rule of memory, is that the closer you are to the context in which you encoded something, the easier the retrieval for that is going to be. In other words, what I mean by that is if you are being tested, and if you're watching this, online in your dorm, you can immediately think about how this applies to you. It's easiest to retrieve information whenever you are at the place where you encoded that information. So it is easier for you to retrieve information if you are the same spot where you were when you first learned about it. So if you are in your dorm bed right now, you're hanging, or if you're in your bed just watching this video, then maybe it's in your best interest to take the exam in your bed. Why is that? Because as we're going to see, what happens is that whenever you are learning this information, you're also learning, you're pairing it up, you're associating it with your surroundings, even though you're not usually consciously aware of it. So that maybe the clock on the wall that's ticking, maybe you're listening to that whenever you're hearing me talk about retrieval cues. And so whenever you're going to take the exam, you hear a ticking clock and you're like, oh yeah, I kind of remember hearing that when we were talking about retrieval cues, which is kind of meta because that would be a retrieval cue acting as a retrieval cue for other information. But the point of that is that whenever you're learning something, you're not just learning just that information, you're also learning that information in a broader environment, and you're pairing that environment with the information. Now, the further you get away from that environment, the harder it is to retrieve that information. This is especially upsetting when we talk about standardized tests. I don't know how much y'all had to deal with this, but back in the day, the SAT, for example, I remember I had to drive 40 minutes to another town to take the SAT, and it was really discombobulating because I'm taking it in another city from where I normally learn things. Whenever I was in high school, and I'm taking an exam, I'm able to take that exam in the same context in which I learned that information, and that's really helpful for memory. It makes it easier to retrieve those memories. But whenever I go to a totally different institution, and they put me in a lunchroom and I'm trying to take the exam in there, is much harder to retrieve that information because I'm so far away from the context in which I originally learned or encoded that information. So this is true, this idea of the context and having it be as close as possible to encoding. That is true not just for physical context, but it's also true for emotional context. So how you are feeling when you retrieve something, the closer that is to when you encoded it matters. We'll talk about that. It's also true for the semantic context and for the environment. First, I want to talk about the encoding specificity principle. The idea of the encoding specificity principle is that your ability to retrieve a stimulus is going to depend on how similar that stimulus is in retrieval compared to when it was encoded. And maybe the best example of this would be like how usually whenever we are taking an exam, and if you see a question that is word for word what you studied, it's very, very easy to get that right. It pops into your head immediately, you recognize it, and you're like, oh, great, this is awesome, right? Your memory for that is very, very good. If I was to go in and if I were to change the wording of that, then it's much, much harder, right? And that is an example of the encoding specificity principle. And we kind of touched around some of these ideas last chapter when we talked about the levels of processing, right? About how, like, you don't want to just kind of think about the wording of a definition, because then you're only getting it at that visual structural level, right? And so the encoding specificity principle basically says, like, hey, the more you elaborate on encoding, on learning and ingesting that information, the better job you do of that, the easier it is going to be for you to retrieve it. One of my very favorite examples of this kind of context-dependent memory comes from Godden and Baddeley. If you remember the name Baddeley, that is because we saw him in Chapter 6. He is one of the original authors of Working Memory. So shortly after he published that chapter, he came up with this completely ludicrous experiment. This experiment is so nuts. This is a baffling... this is a baffling... sorry, I lost my train of thought. It's a baffling experiment because I can't imagine getting away with it today. So what's so weird about it? Here's what's weird about it. He brought in people to go scuba diving and to make them remember lists of words. So he's making people learn lists of words both underwater and on land. And then he was going to test them, their ability to retrieve that, either underwater or on land. And you can find this this figure in your textbook. Basically what they found, and I'm going to break this down for a second. Let's take a look at the green, for example. So the test environment, this is retrieval. And then down here it says studied on land, but you can think of like encoded on land and encoded underwater. If you want to use that language instead, it means the same thing. So let's take a look at land first. So when we have people studied on land and they retrieved that information that they learned on land, what do you know? They do really, really good at it. Whenever you have people who are retrieving information on land, things that they studied underwater, they do much worse, right? So here they're retrieving information on land. When that information was originally encoded on land, they do well. When it was originally encoded underwater, they do much worse. They do 6 items worse, which is almost 50%. So it's a huge drop off here. Alright, so let's take a look now at retrieving things that are underwater. So, and I'll start over here. So whenever they encoded information underwater scuba diving, and then they had to retrieve that information underwater, they did pretty good. They remembered about 12 items. Whenever they studied it underwater and then came up on land, actually, hold on. Nope, sorry. Whenever they studied something on land and then went underwater to retrieve that information for the exam, they did worse again. So the big lesson of this is that if you study something on land, you should be tested on it on land. If you study something underwater, you would want to be tested on it underwater. The reason why I said this is such a baffling experiment is because can you imagine a more stark difference between learning contexts? One, you are above water, you can breathe in and be alive, and then the other situation, you are in a scuba suit underwater mingling with fishes and whatever, right? So a totally different context. And even then, you have some pretty big differences in the results here, but oftentimes for normal everyday memory, this is like a difference of classrooms, right? Like the example that I give about learning an SAT, learning for the SAT exams, being in my classroom and encoding there versus retrieving it in a different town, that's not nearly as different as what Baddeley and Godden did here. So just kind of an interesting thing, but it really kind of shows in this extreme example that yes, the context does matter, and the closer that we get to encoding, the closer we get the encoding context to the retrieval context, the closer those things are, the better we are going to be at retrieving memory. But you may remember that I also said that this is also true for emotional content as well. And so this is, you may have talked about this in abnormal psychology whenever you talk about depression and things like that, but it's easier to remember happy memories whenever we are happy. This is an example of making sure that the encoding environment and the retrieval environment are similar, right? That whenever we encode something and we are happy, we're more likely to retrieve those happy memories because we are in the same emotional situation, right? The opposite is also true. Whenever we are feeling sad, when we are depressed, it's much easier for us to retrieve other memories that were created whenever we were sad or depressed. So the way that they tested this for this particular study is they had people memorize a huge list of words, and in this list of words there were some words that were negative, some words that were positive, and some words that were neutral. So the negative ones would be words like murder and fall and injury and sad and things like that. Positive words would be like celebration, winning, joy, smile, things like that. And neutral would be like lamp, cube, helicopter, things like that. And so what you can see here, this is a very similar kind of graph as this one over here, so I'm going to walk through it for a second. Here we have mood state at test, so this is the retrieval condition. So here we have participants that are in a good, happy mood. And then over here we have participants that are in a bad mood. And what we find, let's look at the negative words, so the darker line right here, when people are in a happy mood, they do a pretty bad job of remembering those sad items. But when they're in a happy mood, they do really good at remembering these positive words. So they are better at remembering happy words. If we look at the folks that had depression that were doing the study, that they were much better at remembering these negative words, these words that had negative connotations, that were sad to think about, and they did just the opposite on the happy words, right? You can see over here that it was basically a mirror opposite. There wasn't a huge difference in terms of neutral words, but it seems like the folks that were in the depression condition remembered a few more neutral words compared to the happy condition. But either way, the real point here is the difference in positive words versus negative words depending on if someone is happy or somebody is sad. If somebody is sad, that emotional context is going to help them retrieve other sad memories. Maybe the way that you feel is the retrieval cue. Maybe you're like, oh man, I haven't felt like this since blank. And that can be a happy thing or a bad thing depending on how you're feeling. This is referred to as state-dependent learning. With state-dependent learning, your physical state is also the context. Your physical state is what is helping you retrieve that information. It's easier for you to retrieve information when you are in the same kind of emotional, physiological state that you were in whenever you learned that information. So it's just like the external environment, only this time it's internal. And that's really the difference between context-dependent memory. So if you hear context-dependent memory, context-dependent is external cues, state-dependent is internal cues. So one example that somebody in one of my classes had mentioned, apparently she had heard this before, is that chewing gum, some people recommend chewing gum whenever you study, and the idea is that, like, if you always chew the same kind of mint gum while you're studying, then whenever you go to take an exam and you chew that mint gum might serve as a retrieval cue if you only use it to study. But you can also think about this, like, if you generally study whenever you are drunk, then maybe you should take the exam when you are drunk, right? Because being drunk might serve as a retrieval cue. Now, obviously, I'm just joking. Please do not do this. I am putting this video up on YouTube in public, so do not snitch on me and tell on me and say that, hey, Professor Daniel said that we should get drunk and come to class. I'm not saying that, dude. And now you have me giving this explanation that that's not what I meant. So that's going to be my alibi. So please don't take the exam while you're drunk. But if you've ever wondered, and I know many of you don't drink, right? But those of you that have been around drunk folks know, what do drunk folks love talking about? They love talking about other things that happened when they were drunk, other things they did when they were drunk. And that's the reason why. It's because of state-dependent learning. That basically their now drunken state is helping them retrieve other memories that were encoded in that same kind of state, in that drunken state. But we can be more positive about this if we want to. Instead of saying alcohol or drunk, you could say like coffee and caffeine, right? That maybe if you always study using a cup of coffee, you should take the exam with a cup of coffee as well. All right, let's talk about mnemonics. Very closely related idea here. Mnemonics are basically just kind of strategies to help make retrieval cues efficient. They are going to be learning aids, they are strategies, they are tips and tricks that are going to help you retrieve memories. And you already know some of these because we generally are taught these growing up. So one of my favorite examples here is the biological taxonomy, and whenever I've taught this in the class, in person, whenever I talk about this specific example, people don't tend to know what I'm talking about. So hopefully, if you haven't taken biology yet as part of your core curriculum, maybe this will help you. That whenever you're trying to identify what a species is, there's a long list of Latin words you got to remember, because it refers to that species' kingdom, its phylum, its class, its order, its family, its genus, and its species. That is how it is categorized. But that's a lot of information to remember, right? How do you know which comes first, the phylum or the class or the order, or the order or the family or the genus? I have no idea, right? Those all feel very arbitrary. So what my professor taught me is that one really easy way to remember this order is to learn this phrase: kings play chess on funny green stools. That is a sentence. It is one that has some kind of vivid imagery in it, because we can think about kings playing chess on these weird kind of green stools, right? You can imagine that. Can you imagine kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species? It's the same number of words, right? But the difference here is that we can imagine one of these. We can think of, we can imagine it, or we can visualize it, or we can kind of come up with other kinds of related imagery that helps us remember this. We can't really do that for kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. It just feels arbitrary and random. It doesn't even form a sentence. So if I'm trying to remember these 7 arbitrary words, then I can remember the first letter here is K, the first letter here is P, the first letter here is C, the first letter here is O, first letter here is F, first letter here is G, first letter here is S. K, P, C, O, F, G, S. So that's how I would remember that. But there's a good chance that you have also done something like this with Roy G. Biv whenever you're trying to identify the colors of the rainbow in order, right? We have red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. And we know that because of Roy G. Biv. Otherwise, it might be kind of hard because we can, those colors feel kind of arbitrary, the order in which they are presented in. In both of these cases, what we have done is we have found a way to use a retrieval cue to access that memory when otherwise it would be kind of hard to do. So it's kind of like, I always think of this as kind of like we're like using shortcuts that we learned from just a couple of slides ago about how if we take things that are close to if we try to take the way that we retrieve information and we try to make it similar to how we encode it, that can be helpful. We're taking a lot of those ideas and we are using them now to kind of hack our brain and come up with these shortcuts and these other kind of learning strategies. A couple of other mnemonics before I change the subject. Another one that always sticks with me is please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. So please excuse my dear Aunt, oops, I must spelled Aunt wrong, Aunt Sally. Some of you also know this as PEMDAS, right? And so you know that that is the order of operations in arithmetic. That is parentheses, exponent, multiplication, division, addition, subtraction. And I remembered that because of please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. Parentheses, exponent, multiplication, division, addition, subtraction. So that's one you may remember. Another one that you may remember is the quadratic equation. I remember learning this in 8th grade. Thank you, Miss Tanner. There's no way you're watching this, but I thought, every time I teach this class, I always think about you because you taught me Frère Jacques, the French song, as a way to do this. So x equals negative b, x equals negative b, plus or minus the square root of, plus or minus the square root of, b squared minus 4ac, b squared minus 4ac, all over 2a, all over 2a. So I remember that from 8th grade. It's never left me. I don't remember anything else about 8th grade. That's probably where I had my first kiss. I don't even remember that. I do remember the quadratic equation. Why? Because that song is very sticky. It sticks with us, has a great melody, and we can use that great melody as a way to remember something much more complicated. In this case, an algebraic equation. All right, so let's, sorry, I should address this last piece here. The method of loci. This is going to lead us into the next slide. The method of loci is another phrase for memory palace. If you've heard of a memory palace, sometimes you hear it talked about in TV shows and in books and things like that. The memory palace is this imaginary kind of palace that you construct in your mind's eye, in your head, and you can imagine yourself walking through this palace. Not unlike if I were to ask you to close your eyes and to imagine walking from where you are right now to your front door. Could you do it? Yes, you could probably imagine how to get there pretty easily. And you could probably even do it blindfolded, maybe. I'm not going to ask you to try that out. Especially for me, I'm up on the 2nd story. I might really hurt myself if I try to go down the stairs blindfolded like that. But the point of that is, and actually, let me take this a little bit further. You could probably even close your eyes and imagine your middle school. The layout of your middle school. You could probably imagine the layout of Wilson Hall if you go on our campus very much. You could close your eyes and imagine the layout of your high school, of your childhood home, places that you've been to a lot. You typically remember the geography of it pretty well. It's just something that humans are really good at doing. We have a pretty good ability to kind of remember geographic settings. And we can use that as a way to enhance our memory. The way that that's done is you imagine yourself walking through some kind of room that you're familiar with, and you are going to associate elements of that room with items you need to remember. So this could be like, for me, like I remember the house that I lived in when I was in grad school, I used that to remember the list of presidents. How do I do that? Because I'm closing my eyes and I'm imagining pulling into my driveway, and as I do, I'm imagining the tree next to the driveway. George Washington is cutting at it with an axe because the famous story about him cutting down the cherry tree or whatever. And then as I move closer down to my to where I'm going to park, I can see Adams and Jefferson fighting because they did not get along very well. They are the 2nd and they are the 3rd president. And then you can go on and you can talk about, like in my memory palace, I got Martin Van Buren holding up a salt shaker. I got Andrew Jackson hanging out in the sink. Over in my living room, I got Teddy Roosevelt riding a horse. I got Garfield, President Garfield, represented by a picture of Garfield hanging up on my wall. Abraham Lincoln's hanging out in my refrigerator. basically, I have imagined all these different cues around the house so that whenever I need to try to remember the order of presidents, I can just close my eyes and I can imagine myself walking through my house, which I know very well, and that helps me remember all those items. That's called the method of loci, or the memory palace. If you haven't tried it before, definitely I'm going to give you a chance to try it out in a little bit. I would love for you to give it a shot and see what you think. Sorry, I got to talk about history. You know it's my thing. If you want to know a little bit about the memory palace, it was first kind of explored in Grecian times. Back the Greeks, as you may know, were famous orators. What does it mean to be a famous orator? It means that you never shut up. It means you always are giving big speeches. And so I think it was Cicero. Tell me if I'm wrong, but I bet that it's Cicero. Cicero was an orator, and a very famous one. He came up with a lot of different kinds of ways to formulate arguments and things like that. But he was coming up with a really, really difficult, long speech, and he was known for giving very good speeches. And the way that he would do it is he would imagine himself in this kind of Senate room, and he would imagine all of his talking points associated with different columns and different pieces of architecture, so that whenever he was giving the talk, he didn't need notes. He had it all up here because he had associated all these things. So as he's talking, he can just look over to this part, and he remembers what he associated with this piece and what he associated with this piece, and so on and so forth. All right, let's move on. So I'm going to give you an example of how you can use the memory palace. And what you will do, because I'm going to give you a video to try this out with, I want you to pick a house that is very familiar to you. For me, it's my childhood home. That's the most vivid and it's the clearest for me to use. And you can imagine yourself walking in that place, and the things that you need to remember, maybe it's a grocery list, and for whatever reason you can't use your phone, because I know some of these things, it's like, why would we do this anymore? Because you have a phone to do it. But some of it's just kind of fun to do as an exercise to prove to yourself that you can do it. But you'll walk around and you'll remember these things in vivid detail. And what we'll see is that this is going to stimulate our explicit memory, and it's going to combine both the episodic and the semantic forms of our memory. So this is how people are able to remember really, really difficult lists. Like I was telling you about that journalist last chapter who went to the memory championship. If you checked out that video, he talks about how like one of the competitions in that one of the events in that competition is how fast can you memorize a deck of 52 playing cards, right? That seems, without any errors, right? That seems really, really hard to do. People can do it in like 30 seconds. And the way they do that is from using the memory palace along with something else they call the PEG system. The PEG system is this idea that we are not very good, that human beings are not very good at memorizing letters or numbers at all. That it is, if you try to remember a 20-digit number, that's very hard to do. Much harder to do than remembering the first 20 words for a speech, for example. Why is that? The reason why that is because when we have a speech, we understand the meaning of these statements and what they stand for, and it's really easy for us to, because we have that kind of semantic level of processing, remember it and internalize it. But we can do the same thing with letters and numbers. We can just take those and we can convert them into pictures and words and scenes. And the PEG system is going to allow us to do that. Basically what you're going to do is you're going to take a bunch of either random letters or a bunch of random numbers, whichever you need to memorize, and you're going to convert those letters or numbers into pictures and scenes that you can then memorize. So here is the video I want you to check out. So this video right here, check it out whenever you give yourself an honest chance to do this. Take out a sheet of paper, get a pen, block off 7 minutes, and give this a try. Basically what he's going to do is he's going to walk you through how to do it. It is going to feel like a lot of work at first. It is kind of hard, but I bet that you're going to be better than you think you're going to be at doing this. And words of advice, if you want to do your best on this, don't get caught up in the numbers. Don't worry too much about the numbers. Focus more on the images and the pictures that he describes to you and that you see. And then, at the end of that, try to recall the images. Try to recall the things that he said. And even better if you can get it in order. But give that a shot. I think you'll do better than you think you can, because you'll just write out, on your sheet of paper, you can just write out the images you remember, and then you can kind of translate what those numbers were based on the PEG system. The PEG system being this right here. All right. So for example, 314, that would be an M, that would be a T or a D, and that would be an R. And so I could say that this is the word my doctor. That's not very good, but because I'm emphasizing the M, the D, and the R, so that's not really good. Maybe it would be better to say like, oh, actually I can use a T right here, so I could say meter. I can imagine a meter, right? So that's basically what he's doing. He's just going to be adding in vowels here if it looks complicated. All right, so this is a good point for me to take a break. So go ahead and give that a shot, and whenever you're done, come back here, try to decode those images that you learned, and then we'll jump into the second half of our chapter. All right, so I hope you did well on that. I really like doing that in the classroom because it's really fun, because people are like, oh, I don't think I did very well, and then whenever I ask them, what's the first thing you saw, and what's the second thing you saw, the whole class is able to kind of ultimately get all the 33 images, and then we can just together kind of look at those words and kind of find the numbers out of the PEG system, out of that legend. All right. And then in my capstone class, I told you that I taught a memory capstone. I don't do this anymore, but what I used to do is part of their final grade would be to remember the first 100 digits of pi, and I would show them this video and I'd be like, this is the way to do it, this is the easiest way to do it, but part of your final grade will be to, come into my office and then do this, orally in person. I don't do that anymore because it was too stressful for people, but it was so cool to see people do it and to do it well. Alright, so thank you so much for giving that a shot. Let's talk about where memories go. So when we forget something, what happens to those memories? There are kind of two sources of forgetting. Now, most times when we talk about forgetting, what we really mean is that we've lost the ability to retrieve that information. We lost the retrieval cue. But there can be cases where, well, what happened to those retrieval cues? There are two kind of processes that can make those retrieval cues hard for us to access. The first is going to be decay, and the second is going to be interference. And both of these things happen in the human brain, but you will find that there are some people who are like, oh, it's definitely decay, or oh, it's definitely interference. You have these kind of, camps that are set up and are at war with one another. But basically, decay is kind of like your memory is just ultimately going to lose its strength over time. And what happens what is the biological explanation for that? Basically, the neurons that help kind of maintain that memory are either destroyed or they are pruned away through use of different areas of your brain. You're not accessing that memory, and because you're not accessing it, those neurons are now going to pivot and do something else. Or they're just going to die off. They're just no longer going to respond as easily to those other neurons that help maintain that memory to begin with. That is decay. The second is going to be interference. And interference is where memory is replaced or overwritten with other memories. So, for example, let's say that you took social psychology last semester and you don't really remember it all that well right now. So why is that? Is it because you didn't access that information, you didn't think about it, and so those memories lost strength over time? Or is it because what you've learned in this class, you've had to learn so much that it's kind of overwritten and replaced what you learned previous semester, right? That's the question, and people have kind of been testing to see which one it is, and it seems like it's a little bit both, or maybe I should say that it depends, because sometimes it can be one or it can be the other. The biological explanation for why interference occurs is because through experiencing the world, we have some of those neurons are going to rewire onto other networks, and maybe even other networks are rewiring and interfering with these neurons that were originally maintaining a separate memory. Either way, we might lose access for those to retrieve those things. And we'll talk more about decay and interference in Chapter 8 as well, but I wanted to kind of mention them because they're going to tell us a little bit about implicit memory. Now, we talked about priming last chapter, but I wanted to try something. Do you remember the final list of words that I gave you in Chapter 6? There was 15 of them. Do you remember any of them? Most times people will say no, but hey, maybe you're binge watching these videos, and so you remember it pretty well because it was only 30 minutes ago. But if I give you this word stem completion task, now what happens? Now we're like, oh yeah, I remember that this is mother. I remember that this is supreme. I remember that this is crayon. And I remember that this is banner, right? And so if you did do that, or if you look at this now and you're like, oh yes, that is familiar, then what does that mean? What happened to those memories? Researchers, and sorry, I realized I have a couple of slides here that interfere with the point I'm trying to make. What researchers will say is that you didn't lose those memories, you just lost the ability to access those memories, and that priming can help. Priming is whenever you have a stimulus that is going to help you retrieve something else, usually because it's repeated with something, because it was paired with something previously. So in this case, we are using priming. We're using priming because you were not consciously able to recall those words. You weren't able to do it by yourself. But whenever you were given these word stems, you probably were able to retrieve those. That's an example of implicit memory, because you were not consciously able to do that. So this is, I don't think that I showed you this figure last chapter, but this is just showing you the difference in this Meyer and Schenbelt article whenever they had like the word bread and butter, and because those are related, people were much faster at identifying whether they were words or were not words versus whenever those two words were completely unrelated. So this is bringing us now into this section of memory, and specifically we were talking about this piece right here, but that is not the only piece of memory that we're going to be focusing on. So if you then try to, and this is just going to we're just redoing what the demonstration I just gave you. But if I ask you to try to silently remember that list of words, you're probably not going to do a super good job. But if I give you this now, you might actually be better off on this. Whenever I look at this now, and I haven't seen that list since you have, I haven't gone back and looked at them, but I know, like, okay, yep, this is mantle, this is calzone, this is textbook, this is night, this is wagging, this is justice, this is avast, this is fracture. Ooh, do I remember any of the others? Oh, this is personality. Do you? Okay, I do remember these now. Wow, I'm actually impressed with myself because I did not think I was going to be able to do that. Yeah, so I remembered all of these, but I don't think I could have told you any of them. Before I showed you these word stems. But these word stems, the MAN, the CAL, the PER, they are going to serve as retrieval cues to help me access those memories. And you can actually, yeah, I got them all right. Good for me. So you can think about what this means for our long-term memory. I told you that, some researchers believe that this means that long-term memory lasts forever, that long-term memory is infinite, and that we never really lose the ability to access those memories we never lose those memories specifically, but we lose the ability to access them. This article from the 80s looked at people using vocabulary words for foreign languages that they never used again after they learned them in class. And basically what they found is that over 50 years, that generally speaking, the things that people had remembered a year later, people had remembered 50 years later. So the lessons that you learn in college that you still remember a year from now, those are the things that you're going to be more likely to remember in the long run too, decades later. And you can see how that very nicely fits into Ebbinghaus's forgetting curve, right? Ebbinghaus talked so much about how we forget most things within the first 72 hours, right? And then after that, forgetting is slowing down. And so whatever you remember after a week, you typically are going to be well equipped to remember, for a much longer period of time. All right. So let's talk about where these memories go. So we were talking about maybe these memories don't vanish. Maybe they are somewhere in the brain. That somewhere might be the hippocampus. And if it's not the hippocampus can probably tell us where to go to find it. All right, so the hippocampus. I already talked about this slide, but this just reiterates the two separate processes of forgetting. The hippocampus is going to be this area that is widely associated with memory. I would say that if you asked any psych major to name specific areas of the brain and what they do, you'll have the amygdala in there for sure. And the hippocampus is probably going to be another popular one, where that's one that comes up in other classes that you take, and people know what it does, that it's related to memory. One of my favorite examples of this, actually, I talk about in my Psych 101 class, is that if you, I'm having second thoughts about telling this anecdote. I think it's really interesting, but I feel like it might take too long to talk about it. There's a study in the late 90s, they measured London cabbie drivers. If you don't know about London cabs, these black cabs, it's actually quite hard to get qualified to do that. You have to take a very rigorous test to be a cabbie, and that test involves you remembering different routes, how quickly it takes to get from these different obscure locations and things like that. And what they found is that compared to the average motorist, that London cab drivers have larger hippocampuses than the average Londoner. Why is that? Because the researchers speculated that because they have to remember all these different locations and they have to remember essentially a map of London in their head and they're using it every day, that is going to promote neural growth, neural plasticity in the hippocampus, increasing its structural size. So that is, so you may have heard of the hippocampus because of studies just like that. The hippocampus is sensitive to new experiences. Specifically, it is sensitive to new places. Whenever we experience new information, you can see this area be active. And the reason why it's active is because it is going to help us take that new information and consolidate it throughout the brain. Maybe it's going to store some of that information over here. Maybe it's going to store some of it over here or over here. For this reason, I like to think of this as like a train station. That the hippocampus is where new information is going to line up, it's going to get in the hippocampus, and then it's going to be transported somewhere else in the brain. So the hippocampus itself doesn't maybe have a lot of memories inside of it, but it is going to help new information get from here to over there. It is sensitive to long-term potentiation, which is something we talked about at the very end of Chapter 6. So it is sensitive to that use it or lose it kind of phenomenon when it comes to neural growth. That whenever we are forming long-term memories, a lot of that is going to be taking place with the help of the hippocampus. It is also part of the medial temporal lobe, and if that sounds familiar, it's because we talked about the medial temporal lobe when we talked about this individual right here, Clive Waring. I love whenever somebody's name is also a sentence. Clive Waring. Think about it. All right, so I'm going to talk about Clive Waring in just a little bit, but Clive Waring has a historic precursor. There's somebody who came before him that had essentially the exact same ailment, or symptomology, I would say. His name is H.M. H.M. He actually comes up in chapter 1 of our textbook, so you may have seen him in there. But H.M. is the most studied individual in all of psychology. He has had more tests done on him, or he had more tests done on him more than anybody else, and it wasn't even close. Basically, as his story goes, whenever he was a young man, he had very severe epilepsy, and at that time, it was a life or death type of thing. Either they did something to cure or to treat his epilepsy, or he was just not going to survive because his grand mal seizures were so life-threatening that he had to do something. And the neurologist at the time had a very radical idea. He was going to go in and he was going to remove the medial temporal lobe. He was going to move this entire portion of this young man's brain. That area includes the hippocampus, the perihippocampus, and the entorhinal cortex. We've talked about the hippocampus and the perihippocampus already this semester. You already know those are important areas. You should probably leave those in this man's head. But at the time, they did not know what the hippocampus did. So they took out this man's hippocampus. So, and this is really scary to think about, right? That this guy went in for a surgery, he goes in, they take out his hippocampus. He's never going to get that back. This guy loses his memory for the rest of his life through this one neurologist doing his best, I guess, but making the wrong decision. The good news is that removing that part of his brain did actually help to some degree his epilepsy. It probably did save his life through having some really severe surgery. But the downside is that it meant that he was never able to create a new explicit memory for the rest of his life. He was never able to remember something new and be able to vocalize that. In H.M.'s head, he was, every single day was the day that he was going to get his surgery. He had no recollection of getting the surgery. He was always getting ready to have that surgery. As in the book in chapter 1 talks about, and it's really kind of sad, so fast forward a couple of seconds if you don't want to hear something sad. He was very, very close with his uncle, and he would ask about him all the time. And of course, H.M. lived for decades. I think he lived for like 50 years after the surgery. And so at some point, his uncle passed away. And so every single day he would ask about his uncle, only to find his uncle had passed away decades ago. How tragic is that? It's horrifying. But this leads us into a discussion of amnesia. Amnesia is something that you have probably heard before, right? It's used a lot in television shows. It's used a lot in movies as a plot device so that somebody can, I don't know. It's always used in ways that make me annoyed or frustrated, in movies. But H.M. was studied a lot because of amnesia. And amnesia is just the loss of memory. And that can manifest in a couple of different ways. He lost part of his temporal lobes, and because of that, he was unable to create new events. He was just totally unable to ever create a new memory. And that's very similar to Clive Waring. Clive Waring lost his hippocampus due to a disease, and you saw the video of Clive Waring, right, from last chapter. You can see a shortened version of that video here. That kind of it's a very blurry video. You can see him kind of living in this 30-second window. That as soon as he is finishing the sentence that he's talking about, he's already kind of forgotten what he has said. As you can imagine how hard it would be to have a conversation with this person. But these are both examples of lesion studies, and it's because of individuals like this where they damage part of their brain or have it surgically removed, we can see what those areas are responsible for. This is how we know about the hippocampus. And actually, it's because of HM that we learned about implicit memory. And here's how. Because of the mirror tracing task. If you've never heard of the mirror tracing task, it's deceptively difficult. It looks hard. It looks easy, but it's very, very difficult. So, and I'll actually put a link to a mirror tracing task you can do online. I'll put a link to it on Plato, so you can check it out if you like, or you can do it from home. And I highly recommend it because it's a very fascinating thing, and you can actually see yourself improve on it. Okay, so what is mirror tracing task? Basically, you're sitting right here. You can't see your hand because you have a divider right here, but you can see this mirror. And in this mirror, you can see what your hand is doing. And it's your job to use this pencil to draw within these two borders. So you're trying to keep it in there. That's all. That's all you have to do. And the researchers are going to be measuring your reaction time, and they're going to be measuring your accuracy like they always do. But really what they're interested in is how quickly it takes for you to finish writing. To finish drawing. Because what happens, and this is, let's say that for most folks, if you were to try this, the first time you do it, it's going to take you 2 minutes. It's going to take you quite a while. The next time you do it, it's going to take less. The next time you do it, it's going to take even less. The next time you do it, it's going to take less and less and less. Why is that? Because your body is learning something. Your body is memorizing the strategy. That is a form of implicit memory. You aren't maybe able to consciously say how you're able to do this, but much like tying your shoe, you are able to do this. So how does HM relate to this? Because HM came in, and this is actually a shout out to Brenda Milner. Brenda Milner was, sorry, let me put a doctor in front of that. Brenda Milner was a neuroscientist who worked with HM and who is credited as the person who found this remarkable thing out about HM. That HM, when he did this task, he did get faster. He did get better at this. He did have fewer errors while he was doing it, and he got faster. But this shook everything we knew about memory, because what this means is that HM and Clive Waring, they are able to create new memories. They're just not able to create memories that they can articulate. That means that they can create implicit memories, but they can't create explicit memories. And this shows us, through evidence like this, that there are two separate memory systems: an explicit memory system and an implicit memory system. So the different kinds of memory loss that I'll briefly talk about. Let's start in the reverse. Let's talk about anterograde amnesia. Anterograde amnesia is what, I'm trying to write this out, and as usual, my handwriting is atrocious. Anterograde amnesia is what HM and Clive Waring both had, which is the inability to create new memories. And oftentimes this also usually comes with a profound loss of old memories too. But what this means is that people that have anterograde amnesia, they have sensory memory, they have short-term memory, but they can't take things from short-term memory and move it over to long-term memory. They can't consolidate that because they don't have the hippocampus. And the hippocampus helps them do that for explicit memories. So that's what anterograde amnesia is. I wrote this word memento over here because there is a movie called Memento that came out more than 20 years ago. So it's old, but highly recommend it. If you like dramas and mysteries and you like a little bit of violence maybe. It's a movie about a guy who has anterograde amnesia, but he's trying to find the guy who killed his wife. And because he can't create new memories, he has to come up with all these strategies to remember what the guy who killed his wife looks like, right? So he has the clues for this investigation tattooed on his body, so that whenever he wakes up, he can look at these tattoos and remember, oh yeah, I'm supposed to be finding the guy who killed my wife. It's one of the first movies from the guy who directed Interstellar and Inception and The Dark Knight and, all those movies. So, again, highly recommend, check it out. It's very cool. It does a pretty faithful job of kind of showing what anterograde amnesia is like. Retrograde amnesia is what we normally think about when we think about amnesia, which is usually somebody has a very severe head wound, and because of that, they lose their ability to retrieve memories from the past. Sometimes those can come back, but it really depends on the severity of the injury. And then finally we have Korsakoff syndrome. Korsakoff syndrome is where it's actually very similar to anterograde amnesia, where Korsakoff syndrome you have people unable to create new memories because of chronic alcoholism, that they have essentially kind of devastated the neurochemical messengers that allow memory to happen, and because of that have symptoms similar to anterograde amnesia, where they're unable to create new memories. All right. And I just talked about this slide basically, that Clive Wearing, if you watch that video about Clive Wearing, you'll see that there are some things that he doesn't forget, right? He still knows how to play piano. He still knows how to speak English. So he still knows how to get dressed. He still knows how to walk around. And so that means that maybe all of those things are examples of implicit memory. He just can't remember the explicit ones. He can't remember conversations. He can't remember events. But he can remember piano. He can remember language. If you watch that whole documentary, they talk about, like, whenever he leaves the house, strangely, Clive Wearing knows about a path he can take around the block to get back to his house. But if you ask him while he's walking, hey, where are you going? He would say that he doesn't know. Or he say that he doesn't know exactly how to get back home, but he always follows that same route, and he knows how to do that. And that's because a lot of our navigation is also implicit memories. And over time, we can get good at that. But you already knew this, because if you travel to, if you're a commuter and you drive to school a lot, there's a while, it doesn't take long for you to get on autopilot for that. And you don't have to really think about it, right? Because you're taking that explicit memory and converting it into an implicit memory. One of the final things I'll say about explicit versus implicit, because I think this is another really, really cool example of the distinction between the two. And unfortunately, this example is not going to work for everybody. But I want you to think about a hobby that is either sports related or music related. There's a good chance that, or maybe video game related. I'm trying to think of like some kind of skill that you develop over time. So I'm going to give you an example about playing guitar, because I play guitar, and I've tried to teach other folks in the past how to do this, and I find that when I'm trying to explain like how to play a song, it's very easy for me to say like, just do it like this, and then I show them how to do it, and then they say like, wait, what did you do there? And then I have to show them how to do it. I can't just tell them how to do that. And that's because for playing an instrument, a lot of that relies on implicit memory. Just like if you are a basketball player, you might not be able to verbalize and say exactly what you're doing whenever you're dribbling and you're running up to do a layup. You may not be able to explain exactly what your feet are doing or exactly what your wrists are doing, but you can show somebody how it's done. That is an example of an implicit memory. All right, so as in, this section right here, as we're entering the final stretch of this video, just talks about the difference between implicit and explicit, but we've already kind of gone over some of these things. I haven't used this phrase muscle memory. Muscle memory is another great example of implicit memory. If you type using a keyboard, you got muscle memory, right? You don't even have to look at it. You can just type it, and you know if you make a mistake because you have a muscle memory for it. You don't even have to look at the screen. You know you screwed up because of that muscle memory. Other examples, sports and music are also, and video games are also great examples of muscle memory. So implicit memory is going to be knowledge that you can't consciously recall, you can't verbalize it very easily, and explicit memory is information that you can consciously recall. Amnesiacs are often not always able to recall their experience consciously, but might show evidence that they are able to remember things implicitly. So what you're looking at right here, this is... For a second, I was thinking that this was looking at rats. I think this is looking at rats. It actually might be humans now that I think about it. But what they were looking at right here is looking at, yeah, actually this must be humans, but they're looking at a fear response, which is a form of implicit memory, and they're looking over here at an explicit memory. And so they're looking at an individual, so this person has damage in their amygdala, which is for emotion, and then this one has damage in their hippocampus, which we know is for explicit memory. So let's look at the explicit memory condition over here. That the controls, they did really well on it. SM046, whoever that is, they did just as good as controls. And if you look over here, that person has damage in their amygdala, right? So their hippocampus is totally fine. But this dude over here that has a bad hippocampus remembered almost none of this, right? He did very, very badly. But if we look at a fear response, which is a form of classical conditioning, which is a form of implicit memory, we see that this guy that has the amygdala damage, he is not showing any fear response to this classical conditioning paradigm. But the controls do, and so does WC, who has his amygdala just fine, thank you very much, but has issues with his hippocampus. Which means that maybe the hippocampus is not really needed for implicit memory, but is absolutely crucial for explicit memory. Let's see here. I'm going to give you an example of this. Basically, another study that looked at using priming to establish whether or not people remembered things was using an incidental learning task. So they had people come in and they were given a bunch of words and they were asked to label them as real or nonsense. They weren't told anything about that they needed to remember these words. They were just given a list and said, hey, is this a real word or is this nonsense? Then afterwards, they were asked to complete word stems just like you did at the very beginning of this video. And usually what happens is that the people who are unable to say, who are able to recall what they saw, were able to use word stems to guess those words. So let me give you an example of this. If I ask for you to complete this word stem, just look at this and see if you can say what it is. Whenever I give this in a classroom setting in person, I get maybe 20-30% are able to fill in this this word. It's like Wheel of Fortune, right? You got to say what the word is, or Hangman. All right, so whenever this is done in a laboratory test with people that have interrogate amnesia, so Clive Waring or HM, are these people who can't create new memories, they'll look at this and they'll say, hey, I don't know what it is. The control subjects will also say, hey, I don't know what that is. All right. So, now the second part of this task. I want you to try to remember these 5 things. So, I'm going to let you look at these, and then I'm going to remove them. Here we go. Okay. Now, I'm going to ask for you to try to recall what you just saw. Shouldn't be too hard, right? We saw a clown, saw an elephant, I saw a yoo-hoo, I saw a cat. Excuse me, I got hiccups. Well, what was the other one? Oh, sorry, I got hiccups. Sorry, I don't know what to do. I've never had the hiccups like this on a video like this. So those are the 5 things. So if I were to ask that to somebody like Clive Waring or HM, they would say, hey, yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I can't form new memories. I can't tell you what I just saw. If I asked you, you would be able to tell me a cat, a clown, a bottle of yoo-hoo, an elephant, a stop sign. You do pretty good on it. Now, if I asked you to do this word stem now, how would you do? You'd do really, really well on this, right? You'd say, oh yeah, that's an elephant, right? Why? Because you are primed for it. I showed you the elephant over here, and that is going to prime you so that whenever you get to this word stem, you're able to complete it very easily. But the interesting thing is that interrogate amnesia subjects would also get this correct. But they won't exactly know why. Whenever the first time they get this, they can't do it. But just like you, they go through this, and then they'll get it. They'll be able to say elephant. But if you ask them, why did you say elephant? They'll say, I don't know. It just came to me. I don't know why. Because they're not able to consciously recall that memory. So what does that mean? Basically, it means that we have separate memory systems. One that's for explicit, kind of consciously recognizable words or events, things that you can consciously recall, and that's because it relies on your hippocampus. So, if I were to ask you who's the first president of the United States, and you saying George Washington, that's an example of an explicit memory. An implicit memory, on the other hand, is a little bit trickier because those are going to be things that we can't really put into words, that we can't really consciously recall. And these could be conditioning, they can be priming, they can be muscle memory, they can be things that you have perceptually learned. So like learning how to write is an example of an implicit memory. Learning how to ride a bike or do the mirror tracing task, those are all examples of an implicit memory. And those rely on the basal ganglia, which is part of your midbrain, and some elements of the prefrontal cortex too. One of the last things that I want to mention is episodic memory. And episodic memory is a version of explicit memory. Episodic memory is essentially biographical memory. It's your ability to kind of remember the things that are about you. So if I asked you, what did you have for breakfast this morning? That is an example of an episodic memory. If I asked you, hey, where'd you go to high school? That is an example of an episodic memory, because whenever you're thinking about that, you're probably imagining where you were sitting whenever you were eating breakfast, or you remember being in a classroom at that high school. Now, the interesting thing about this, one of the things that I wanted to kind of touch on, because it's kind of like one of those things that I feel like that I bring up a lot, which is that humans and animals are not always all that different. But one way that that they might be different is Tulving, who is a memory researcher from the 70s and 80s, and he did a lot of work with levels of processing. But he's the guy who kind of came up with this concept of episodic memory. And he believed that that non-humans were unable to have episodic memories, that non-humans are unable to remember things about their day. And the reason for that is because he felt like it requires mental time travel. In other words, if I ask you what you have for breakfast, you have to kind of mentally go back in time and kind of imagine yourself earlier in the day to do that. And he argues that your dog and cat can't really do that. But I would be curious to hear what you think about this, especially those of you that have a dog or a cat. And if you watch that video about Chaser that I showed you at the very beginning of this slideshow, I wonder, do you think that Chaser has episodic memory? So episodic memory, just to remind you, the distinction of episodic memory versus what we call semantic memory. That episodic, and both of these are explicit, I should say. The difference of this would be like if I asked you, who is the first president of the United States? You'd say George Washington. That is an example of a semantic memory. If I asked you, where did you first learn that George Washington was the first president of the United States? That is an episodic memory, because you have to remember where you were when that happened. And so people will often say that episodic memory relies on 4 questions. When the memory occurred, what the memory was, where the memory occurred, and who the memory occurred to. This last one, answering who, that one feels kind of obvious. Whenever you think back to imagine what you had for breakfast, who'd that memory happen to? What happened to you, right? But you can't really establish that with non-humans, because you have to have the ability to speak if you're trying to answer this question right here. Really clever scientists have found ways to test these other pieces of memory, and they've found that non-humans can make judgments about when, they can make judgments about where, they can make judgments about what, but it's hard to establish whether or not what they're thinking about, without being able to directly ask them. So one of the things that I want you to think about, and this is going to be the discussion for this chapter, is thinking about how you might take all of this information and apply it to the real world. And I want you to think about, like, especially the first half, when we were talking about context-dependent memory, I want you to think about whenever you're studying for this exam now, I want you to try to, like, if you got your study guide or whatever, try to prepare, study where you know you're going to take the exam. and see if doing that helps you out at least a little bit. And then beyond that, you know, maybe even try using the memory palace to remember certain kind of difficult ideas and definitions, you know. Or if you typically study at 6 p.m. in the afternoon, try taking the exam at 6 p.m. in the afternoon as well. Because remember, your physiological state is also going to be a retrieval context that you might be able to access. And that is it. We're moving on to chapter 8, which is the last chapter about memory. Thank you so much for this jumbo-sized video. It wasn't as long as I was actually kind of afraid it was going to go up to about 90 minutes, but we didn't let it go on that long. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you have any questions at all, feel free to let me know. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed learning the first 100 digits of pi, and I will see you on Play-Doh later. Bye-bye.